The vinyl on the booth seat was cracked, a web of tiny fissures that mapped decades of hurried breakfasts and lonely late-night coffees. Arthur Vance ran a thumb over one of the cracks, feeling the worn texture beneath his skin. The diner, a small, stainless steel relic called the corner spot, was his sanctuary. It smelled of frying bacon, stale coffee, and the faint, sweet perfume of the cherry pie cooling on the counter. It was a place where a man could be invisible, and for Arthur, invisibility was a kind of peace. He wore a simple, gray windbreaker that had seen better years and a pair of faded jeans. His hands, resting on the Formica tabletop, were gnarled with arthritis, but they were steady. At 68, his movements were deliberate, economical, born of a life that had taught him the cost of wasted energy. He was halfway through his lukewarm coffee when the diner door flew open, slamming against its stopper with a violent crash. A wave of cold November air rushed in, carrying the scent of exhaust and arrogance. 3 men swaggered in, led by one who seemed to suck all the quiet warmth out of the room. He was young, maybe 30, with slicked-back hair, a designer jacket that looked out of place against the diner's humble decor, and a smirk that seemed permanently affixed to his face. This was Rick. His 2 companions were thick-necked shadows, flanking him like gargoyles. The trio slid into the booth directly behind Arthur. Their laughter was loud, abrasive, shredding the comfortable silence. Arthur flinched but didn't turn. He just wanted to finish his coffee and be on his way. He reached for the sugar dispenser, his movements slow. As he lifted it, his elbow inadvertently brushed the back of the booth. It was the slightest of contacts, a whisper of fabric on vinyl. It was enough. "Hey, old man." The voice was sharp, cutting. "Watch what you're doing." Arthur froze, his hand still on the dispenser. He slowly turned his head, his pale blue eyes meeting Rick's. "I beg your pardon?" he said, his voice quiet, raspy from disuse. Rick leaned over the back of the booth, his face unpleasantly close. His breath smelled of stale cigarettes and something artificially sweet. "You heard me. You just bumped my seat. You got a problem with personal space." Arthur could feel the eyes of the other patrons on him. The family in the corner booth, the 2 truckers at the counter, Sarah the owner, who was polishing a glass with a suddenly trembling hand. They were all watching, their faces a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. He felt a familiar heat rise in his chest, an old ghost he had spent a lifetime trying to lay to rest. He took a slow breath. "It was an accident. I apologize." The apology hung in the air, simple and direct. But Rick wasn't interested in apologies. He was interested in dominance. He smirked, a cruel twist of his lips. "An accident? Looks to me like you're just clumsy, Pops. Or maybe you've had a little too much to drink this morning." He gestured with his chin toward Arthur's coffee cup. His friends snickered. The humiliation was a physical thing, a heavy cloak settling over Arthur's shoulders. He was being made a spectacle. His age and quiet demeanor twisted into weapons against him. He turned back around, hoping his silence would be a shield. He wanted to signal that the performance was over, that the audience could go back to their lives. But Rick was a performer who demanded an encore. He wanted to break something, and the quiet, dignified old man in the faded windbreaker was the perfect target. The air grew thick with unspoken tension, and the clatter of silverware in the diner ceased entirely, leaving only the sound of Rick's grating voice and the hum of the old refrigerator. Rick slid out of his booth and loomed over Arthur's table, casting a long, sharp shadow. His presence was an invasion, a violation of the small pocket of peace Arthur had carved out for himself. "I don't think you're sorry enough," Rick said, his voice dropping to a low, menacing tone that was somehow louder than his previous shouts. He planted his hands on Arthur's table, leaning in so close that Arthur could see the tiny broken blood vessels in his eyes. "A man bumps into me. He looks me in the eye and says he's sorry like he means it. You look like you're about to fall asleep in your coffee." Arthur didn't move. He kept his gaze fixed on the swirling brown liquid in his cup. To look up would be to engage, to accept the terms of this ugly confrontation. He had spent the last 40 years of his life avoiding this exact kind of conflict. He had seen enough of it to last 1,000 lifetimes. He had seen what it did to men, how it hollowed them out, leaving nothing but rage and regret. He would not let this cheap bully drag him back into that darkness. "Leave him alone," a voice piped up. It was Sarah, the owner. She stood behind the counter, her hands gripping a dish rag so tightly her knuckles were white. Her face was pale, but her eyes held a spark of defiance. "He didn't do anything." Rick straightened up slowly, turning his head to fix her with a venomous glare. "You talking to me?" he asked, a dangerous silkiness in his voice. His two friends stood up as well, their bulky forms creating a human wall. The message was clear. Sarah's defiance faltered. She swallowed hard, her gaze dropping back to the glass she was polishing. The brief flicker of support was extinguished. The silence in the diner returned, heavier and more complete than before. It was the silence of complicity, of fear. Rick turned his attention back to Arthur, emboldened by his easy victory. "See? Nobody's on your side, old man. Now I'm going to ask you one more time. Apologize." Properly, he jabbed a finger toward Arthur's face. The other patrons were trapped. The family in the corner pulled their kids a little closer. The truckers at the counter stared intently at their plates, their shoulders hunched. They were big men, capable men, but they were also just passing through. This wasn't their town, not their fight. Getting involved meant police reports, lost time, complications. So they remained silent, their inaction a quiet verdict. Arthur was on his own. The weight of their collective gaze was a judgment. They saw a frail, elderly man being harassed, and they did nothing. Perhaps they judged him, too. Why didn't he just say sorry again and end it? Why was he being so stubborn? They didn't see dignity. They saw a problem disrupting their morning. The conflict had reached its peak. Rick, high on the power of intimidation, needed a final act to cement his dominance. He looked down at Arthur's simple breakfast. A single, uneaten piece of toast and the cup of coffee. With a sneer, he reached out and, with a flick of his wrist, slapped the coffee cup. It flew from the table, spinning through the air and crashing against the checkered linoleum floor. Hot, brown liquid exploded outwards, splattering across the floor and soaking the cuff of Arthur's worn trousers. The ceramic mug shattered, the sound unnaturally loud in the silent room. "Oops," Rick said, his voice dripping with false sincerity. "Clumsy me. Now look at the mess you made me make." The scent of spilled coffee filled the air, sharp and bitter. It was a final, blatant act of disrespect, a line crossed. Arthur stared at the puddle spreading on the floor, at the dark stain blooming on his pants. He felt the heat of it seeping through the fabric, a dull, stinging warmth against his skin. This was the moment where a man either breaks or finds a strength he didn't know he still possessed. Every person in the diner held their breath, waiting to see which it would be. A flicker of motion, a ghost in the periphery of Arthur's vision. It wasn't the diner, but a different place, hot and suffocatingly green. The air was thick with the smell of mud, cordite, and fear. He was 20 years old again, his knuckles white as he gripped the stock of his M16. A young man next to him, a kid from Ohio named Miller with a picture of his sweetheart taped to his helmet, was whispering a prayer. The jungle was alive with sounds that didn't belong. The snap of a twig, the unnatural silence of birds. Then chaos, a sudden, blinding flash, the roar of an explosion that deafened him, and the sight of Miller, his prayer unfinished, thrown back like a rag doll. Arthur had crawled through the mud, ignoring the shrapnel that tore at his own leg, and pulled Miller's broken body behind the flimsy cover of a banyan tree. He had held his hand, trying to stop the bleeding, whispering empty promises that they'd both make it home. Miller's eyes had been wide with surprise, as if he couldn't quite believe this was how his story ended. He blinked, and the jungle was gone. The smell of cordite was replaced by bitter coffee. The suffocating humidity was just the stale air of the diner. But the feeling was the same, a profound, soul-deep weariness. He had made a promise over Miller's body, and over the bodies of so many others. A promise to live a life worthy of their sacrifice. A life of peace. He had promised his wife, Martha, the same thing years later, as she lay in a sterile hospital bed, her hand frail in his. She had loved his quiet nature, the gentleness he had cultivated from the ashes of war. "Don't ever let them take that from you, Artie," she had whispered, her voice a fragile thread. "Your peace. It's the most precious thing you have." That peace was now being threatened by a cheap thug in a diner over a spilled cup of coffee. The rage was there, coiled deep inside him. It was an old, familiar beast. It whispered to him, telling him how easy it would be to stand up, how easy it would be to take the man's wrist and use a simple compliance technique to bring him to his knees. His body, though old, remembered the training. The muscle memory was buried, but not gone. He knew a dozen ways to end this confrontation with swift, efficient violence. The beast wanted to be fed. But Martha's voice was stronger. Miller's surprised eyes were clearer. He looked at Rick's smug, ignorant face and saw not a threat, but a profound sadness. This boy, this man-child, knew nothing of real conflict, of real loss. His entire world was built on a fragile foundation of ego and intimidation. To fight him would be to descend to his level, to break the promise he had made to the dead and to the woman he loved. He would not trade his 40 years of hard-won peace for 5 seconds of satisfaction. His strength was not in his fists, but in his restraint. It was the only thing he truly owned. This internal battle, fought in the space of a few seconds, was more intense than any physical altercation could ever be. He made his choice. He would not fight. He would endure. The pressure in the room was a physical weight. Rick stood over him, a predator savoring the kill, his chest puffed out. "Well?" he demanded, his voice a low growl. "Are you going to clean that up? Or are you going to sit there looking stupid?" His two friends chuckled, a low, guttural sound that echoed the ugliness of the moment. The challenge was laid bare. It was no longer about a bumped seat or a spilled coffee. It was about submission. Rick wanted to see Arthur on his knees. Arthur looked from the spreading puddle on the floor to Rick's sneering face. He saw the expectation in the bully's eyes. He saw the fear and pity in the eyes of the other patrons. They expected him to refuse, to argue, to call the police. They expected the scene to escalate into shouting, or worse. Sarah stood frozen behind the counter, her hand over her mouth, her face a mask of helpless anguish. She was just a small business owner, likely terrified of what a man like Rick could do to her diner, to her livelihood, if she intervened. Her silence was not born of malice, but of fear, and Arthur understood that completely. He felt the silence of the room press in on him. Each patron was an unwilling member of the audience, their stillness a form of participation. They were witnesses, and their inaction was a powerful statement. They were allowing this to happen. Arthur didn't blame them. He knew how the world worked. People looked away. They didn't want trouble. Trouble was messy, unpredictable. It was easier to stare at your plate and wait for it to pass. But their silence amplified his isolation, making the small diner feel like a vast, empty stage where he was the sole actor in a tragedy of his own making. The heat from the spilled coffee on his leg was beginning to fade, leaving a damp, uncomfortable chill. The sharp, acrid smell was starting to give him a headache. Rick took a step closer, crowding him further. "I'm losing my patience, Grandpa," he hissed. The threat was no longer veiled. It hung in the air, thick and suffocating. This was the precipice. A moment stretched into an eternity. Arthur knew that his next action would define him, not in their eyes, but in his own. He had to choose between his pride and his principles, between the beast of his past and the peace he had promised Martha. The choice was clear. It was painful, but it was clear. With a quiet grace that defied the ugliness of the situation, Arthur Vance began to move. He did not rise to fight. He did not shout in protest. Instead, he slid out of the booth, his movements slow and deliberate. His knees popped audibly in the silent room as he lowered himself, first to one knee, then to both. He was on the floor, on the same level as the shattered ceramic and the spreading puddle of coffee. He ignored the dark stain on his trousers and the sticky liquid that was now soaking into the knees of his jeans. He reached for the paper napkin dispenser on his table, pulled out a small handful of thin, flimsy sheets, and began to wipe at the mess. His actions were methodical, precise. He gathered the larger shards of the broken mug first, his gnarled fingers carefully picking them up one by one and placing them on a clean napkin to the side. Then, he began to sop up the coffee, the small napkins quickly becoming saturated. He made no sound, no sigh of protest, no grunt of exertion. His face was a mask of calm neutrality. This was his action, his sacrifice. It was an act of profound, almost shocking humility. But it was not submission. To the casual observer, it looked like defeat. A broken old man, forced to his knees by a young bully. But for Arthur, it was the opposite. It was a victory. He was choosing to absorb the ugliness of the moment, to de-escalate the conflict not with weakness, but with a strength that Rick could never comprehend. He was refusing to let the man's poison infect him. He was cleaning up a mess, yes, but he was also cleansing the room of its toxic anger. He was holding onto his dignity not by defending his pride, but by honoring his promise to Martha. As he knelt on the cold, sticky floor, surrounded by the silent judgment of strangers, Arthur Vance had never been stronger. He was at peace. A subtle shift began to ripple through the diner. It started with the family in the corner. The mother, who had been shielding her son's eyes, slowly lowered her hand. She wasn't looking at Rick anymore. She was looking at Arthur, kneeling on the floor. Her expression was no longer one of fear, but of dawning, gut-wrenching shame. She saw not a victim, but a man of immense character. She saw the steady, deliberate way he cleaned, the lack of anger or bitterness in his posture. She saw a quiet resilience that shamed her own silence. At the counter, one of the truckers finally looked up from his plate. He was a big man with a weathered face and a beard thick with gray. He watched Arthur for a long moment, his jaw tight. He slowly put his fork down, the metallic clink echoing in the quiet room. He caught the eye of the other trucker, who gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. A silent conversation passed between them, one of respect for the old man and contempt for the bully. They still didn't move, but their presence in the room had changed. They were no longer passive observers. They were witnesses, their judgment now firmly cast. Even Rick seemed momentarily confused. He had expected resistance, anger, pleading. He had expected a fight or a pathetic display of fear. This quiet, methodical act of cleaning was not on his script. It disarmed him, robbing his victory of its satisfaction. He looked around, seeking the approval of the crowd, but found only averted eyes and stony faces. The power he had felt just moments before was beginning to curdle into uncertainty. Sarah, behind the counter, let out a small, choked sob. Tears welled in her eyes as she watched the old veteran on his hands and knees. She saw the whole sordid affair with sudden, painful clarity. She saw her own fear, her own cowardice. And she saw the incredible strength in Arthur's humility. The whispers started then, quiet murmurs that spread from booth to booth. "That's not right," someone muttered. "He's just an old man." The tone of the room had fundamentally changed. The fear was still there, but it was now mixed with a potent cocktail of shame and a budding, collective respect for the man on the floor. The silence had been broken, not by a shout, but by the quiet power of a dignified man's sacrifice. The community, once passive, was beginning to wake up. It started as a low rumble, a distant vibration that you felt more in your bones than you heard with your ears. It was a sound that didn't belong in the quiet morning cityscape. The truckers at the counter paused, their heads cocked. Sarah looked towards the large plate glass window at the front of the diner. The rumble grew steadily, deepening into a throbbing, guttural roar that seemed to shake the very foundations of the building. It was the sound of dozens of heavy displacement engines, a mechanical symphony of controlled power. The sound swelled until it was a deafening thunder that drowned out all other noise. Every head in the diner turned towards the window. Outside, the street was being consumed by a river of chrome and black leather. One by one, then in groups of 2 and 3, massive motorcycles pulled up, lining the curb in a formidable, gleaming row. Harley-Davidsons, mostly, fat boys, road kings, electric glides. The sheer number of them was staggering. 10, 20, 30, then more, until the entire block in front of the diner was occupied by a motorcycle club. On the back of their leather vests, the same patch was visible. A grinning skull in a winged helmet. The Hells Angels. The engines cut out, one after another, the sudden silence almost as shocking as the noise had been. For a moment nothing happened. Then the diner door swung open. A man stepped inside, and the entire room seemed to shrink. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with a long, graying beard braided into 2 sections. His face was a roadmap of hard miles and harder fights. His leather cut was adorned with patches that told a story of loyalty and longevity. This was Preacher. He didn't speak. He simply stood in the doorway, his steel-gray eyes sweeping across the room, taking in the scene with an unnerving calmness. Behind him, more bikers filed in. They moved with a quiet, disciplined purpose, filling the entryway, lining the walls, their presence an overwhelming physical and psychological force. They were a wall of leather, denim, and silent menace. There were 50 of them, at least. They completely filled the small diner, their collective presence sucking the air out of the room. They didn't look at the other patrons. Their focus was singular. It was on the tableau in the center of the room. Rick and his 2 goons standing triumphantly over an old man kneeling in a puddle of spilled coffee. Preacher's gaze settled on Arthur. He saw the worn windbreaker, the stooped shoulders, the gnarled hands methodically wiping the floor. His eyes narrowed, and a flicker of something unreadable passed across his face. He took a slow step forward, his boots heavy on the linoleum. The bikers behind him remained still, a silent, watchful army. The atmosphere in the diner had transformed from tense to something else entirely. It was the calm at the center of a hurricane, a moment of absolute, terrifying clarity before the storm broke. Rick, who had thrived on being the most intimidating man in the room, now looked small and pathetically out of his depth. He and his friends were no longer predators. They were prey, and they had just realized the trap had sprung. Preacher's heavy boots made no sound as he crossed the floor. He moved with a predator's grace, each step deliberate and final. He walked right past Rick, not even bothering to give him a glance, as if the bully were nothing more than a piece of furniture. His entire focus was on the man on the floor. He stopped directly in front of Arthur, his large frame casting a protective shadow over him. He knelt down, a surprising gentleness in the movement. The leather of his pants creaked as he lowered himself to Arthur's level. "Brother," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that was surprisingly soft. "You don't need to do that." Arthur looked up, his pale blue eyes meeting Preacher's. There was no fear in his gaze, only a deep, weary recognition. He seemed to see past the leather vest and the intimidating presence to the man underneath. "A mess is a mess," Arthur said simply, his voice steady. "It needs cleaning up." Preacher's gaze softened. He reached out and placed a large, calloused hand on Arthur's shoulder. "Let me help you up, sir." He helped Arthur to his feet, the old man rising with a quiet dignity. Preacher turned his head slightly, his eyes finally landing on Rick. The look was not one of anger, but of cold, final judgment. "This man," Preacher said, his voice now devoid of any warmth, "is Arthur Vance. In the winter of '68, in the Ia Drang Valley, his platoon was pinned down, ambushed. They were out of ammo, out of time. A grenade landed in the middle of his fire team." Preacher paused, letting the weight of his words settle in the dead silent room. Arthur didn't hesitate. He threw himself on it. A collective gasp went through the diner. Sarah brought her hands to her mouth, her eyes wide with disbelief and horror. "The grenade was a dud," Preacher continued, his voice like grinding stone. "But he didn't know that. He was willing to be blown to pieces for the men next to him." One of those men was my father. Arthur Vance carried my dad, who had taken a round to the leg, 2 miles through enemy territory to an evac chopper. He saved his life. He was awarded the Silver Star for it, but he never wore it. Said he was just doing his job. Preacher's gaze bored into Rick. This man, who you have on his knees cleaning up your mess, is a hero. A better man than you will ever be. And you insignificant little punk, you put your hands on him. The truth landed with the force of a physical blow. The quiet, clumsy old man was a decorated war hero. The patrons looked at Arthur with new eyes, seeing not frailty, but a history of unimaginable courage. They saw the quietness not as weakness, but as the solemn peace of a man who had seen the worst of humanity and chosen a better path. Their shame deepened into a profound sense of awe and regret. Rick's face had gone from smug to uncertain to chalk white with terror. The story had stripped him of all his power, revealing him for what he was. A hollow man, a coward who preyed on those he perceived as weak. He had just slapped a legend, and the legend's family had arrived. Preacher stood up to his full height, a towering figure of righteous fury. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His quiet words were more terrifying than any shout. "You're going to apologize to Mr. Vance," he said, the command absolute. "And then you and your friends are going to walk out that door, and you are never going to set foot in this town again. Am I clear?" Rick was trembling, his bravado completely shattered. He could only nod, his eyes wide with fear. He turned to Arthur, his face a pathetic mask of terror. I'm sorry," he stammered, the words catching in his throat. "I didn't know." "No," Preacher cut in, his voice like ice. "You didn't care. There's a difference." 2 of the bikers stepped forward silently. They didn't touch Rick, but they flanked him, their sheer physical presence hurting him and his terrified friends towards the door. The trio stumbled out into the cold morning air, disappearing from sight. They were erased, their brief, ugly reign of terror brought to a decisive end. With the trash taken out, the atmosphere in the diner transformed. The tension didn't just dissipate. It was replaced by a powerful wave of respect and contrition. Preacher turned back to Arthur, his expression softening once more. "Let's get you a new table." Arthur, another biker, was already there, pulling out a chair at the cleanest booth in the diner. A third biker appeared with a steaming mug of fresh coffee, placing it gently on the table. Sarah rushed out from behind the counter, tears streaming down her face. "Mr. Vance, I am so sorry," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I was scared. I should have done something." Arthur gave her a small, gentle smile. "You have a business to protect, Sarah." I understand. His forgiveness was absolute, and it only deepened the respect in the room. "From now on," Sarah declared, her voice ringing with conviction, "you never pay for a meal in here again, ever. It's the least I can do." Preacher placed a heavy hand on Arthur's shoulder. "We've been looking for you for a while, Arthur. My dad passed last year. He asked me to find you, to thank you one last time." He unzipped his leather vest and began to remove it. It was a sacred object, a biker's cut, covered in patches that represented years of loyalty, brotherhood, and miles on the road. It was his identity. He held it out to Arthur. "We're having a new one made for you, but until it's ready, we'd be honored if you'd wear this one. It has our back. And now we have yours." The gesture was stunning. Giving a civilian a club vest, even temporarily, was the highest possible sign of respect and protection. It was an adoption. Arthur looked at the heavy leather vest, at the grinning skull patch, and for the first time that morning, his eyes glistened with tears. He had been alone for so long since Martha died, a ghost moving through the world. Now, in the most unlikely of places, he had found a brotherhood. He slowly reached out and took the vest. It was heavy, imbued with the weight of loyalty and honor. The bikers in the room watched, their expressions solemn, nodding in approval. The community, the truckers, the family, all watched in silence, witnessing an act of profound recognition, a debt of honor being paid in full. The final image was one of quiet, profound transformation. Arthur Vance sat in the booth, the heavy leather vest draped over the back of his chair like a king's robe. The grinning skull of the Hell's Angels patch faced the room, a silent declaration. It was a shield, a symbol that this man was no longer invisible. He was protected. In front of him sat a fresh, hot breakfast, brought by a tearful Sarah. A plate piled high with eggs, bacon, and toast. A feast to replace the single piece of toast and shattered cup of coffee. He wasn't eating alone. Preacher sat opposite him, and the booth was crowded with other bikers, their large forms creating a living wall around him. They weren't talking much. They just sat with him, sharing the space, their presence a comforting, solid weight. The rest of the bikers stood scattered throughout the diner, some leaning against the counter, others by the window, a silent, standing guard. The other patrons had finished their meals but hadn't left. They lingered, watching the scene unfold, as if unwilling to break the spell. They were no longer just customers. They were a congregation that had witnessed a moment of grace. The trucker who had first looked up from his plate walked to the counter, paid his bill, and left a $50 tip. "For the old soldier's breakfast," he told Sarah, his voice gruff with emotion, before walking out. Outside, the 50 motorcycles stood gleaming in the morning sun, a formidable honor guard. Their silent engines held a promise of thunderous power, a pledge of loyalty that could be unleashed at a moment's notice. The street, once a scene of disruption, was now a symbol of sanctuary. People on the sidewalk slowed as they passed, staring at the incredible sight of the diner, filled with bikers, and the long, gleaming line of Harleys. Arthur took a slow bite of his toast. He looked out the window, past the reflection of the bikers surrounding him, to the town beyond. For years, he had felt like a ghost in this town, a relic of a forgotten war, a widower lost in his memories. He had sought invisibility as a shield, but now he was seen. He was known. The respect he had been given was not for the medal he never wore or the act of bravery buried in the past, but for the quiet dignity he had refused to surrender on a cold diner floor. Preacher raised his coffee mug. "To Arthur Vance," he said, his voice a low rumble that filled the room. Every biker raised their mug in a silent, solemn toast. Arthur looked at the faces around him, weathered, scarred, intimidating, and saw only brotherhood. He gave a small, slow nod, a lifetime of unspoken gratitude in the simple gesture. The quiet old man in the corner diner was alone no longer. He belonged. And as the sun climbed higher in the sky, casting long shadows from the row of waiting motorcycles, the low, powerful rumble of their engines starting up one by one would not be a sound of menace, but the sound of family. It was the sound of respect, earned through sacrifice and sealed in brotherhood, a promise echoing through the streets that the town's quietest hero would never be overlooked again.